everyone. Welcome and good day. My name is Jen Walinga. I am a professor in the School of Communication and Culture at Royal Roads University, and welcome to our webinar series on sport, leadership, and social change. Today, we've got part 4 of a suite of episodes that all have to do with building cultural integrity across the Canadian sports system in particular. And we hope that someday Canada really will be the leader in building this kind of integrity. And we've examined it from a number of different perspectives for this particular topic of culture. Today, we're going to be talking about power and power balance, power dynamics in sport. We're really looking forward to having the conversation with some fabulous guests. I come to you from the lands of the Lekwungen and Kusepsin First Nations. We also call them our partners, and Songhees and Esquimalt communities. We are very privileged to be operating on these unceded territories. And as you know, we're trying our best to acknowledge the harms inflicted, the gaps in our historical knowledge and teachings and education, and try to reconcile the values that we uphold as Canadians, respect and equity, justice and peace, with our actions going forward. And I know at Royal Roads, we take this very seriously. These lands do belong to, they were unceded, and yet they've been reclaimed because DND has relinquished them finally back to our First Nations communities, and they work with us to allow us to still work on the lands and operate as a university for social change and social purpose. Very happy to see lots of people joining us and some good friends from the past, and great to see you, Carol Love. Thanks for joining us. I'm sure Andrea is very thrilled as well. I always give a little bit of a preamble just to give some background on the university, but also how it intersects with this webinar series, because we don't really have sports teams here. We have peacocks, a great mascot, and lots of great intramurals and a wonderful gym, etc. But we're really about working professionals who are coming back to school to get some kind of credential and continue their education. But we also take into consideration people's professional experience as a part of our flexible admission. We do that with athletes as well. So they've got professional learning that's occurred when they've been operating in competitive and training environments internationally and domestically. We learn from our topics. So we have programs in humanitarian studies, peace and conflict, education, technology, communication, culture, business, etc. And we believe within these realms that there is truth. And we also tackle big overarching topics like climate and justice. And sport is another one of those, especially here in Canada, as we encounter and address and navigate our way through some of the crises that we're facing in terms of violence, abuse, cheating, doping, etc. We're looking to sport. It holds the truths, the principles. I often tell students who are studying sport as part of their graduate studies that the answers are actually in your sport as well. So look to it. And that's what we do with this wonderful webinar. We spend a lot of time on these grounds here at Royal Roads on the campus, and there's so much it has to teach us, of course. We're on 300 hectares of old growth. We have one of the largest and oldest trees in Canada on our property, and it has so much wisdom to teach us, just like sport does. I always point to the bridge and some of the other artifacts, cultural artifacts within our campus community. And the bridge is really important to our School of Communication and Culture because it illustrates exactly what I think sport does too, that it's always a partnership. And it's all about diversity, understanding, minding the gaps, minding the diversity before you try to build connections. You have to understand the two banks, what you're dealing with before you can try to establish some kind of connection. And that's the same with a great pass in rugby or basketball. It's really a partnership. The passer and the passee both have to be ready, connected, understanding, and prepared to complete the pass. But it's both people's responsibility. And sport has had such power. We've seen and been so proud of our sport participants, whether they're coaches, athletes, staff, administrators, who are taking their platform, using the huge platform of sport that's available to us, because it really has incredible reach and impact. It's one of the most watched and participated in human endeavors in the world. And they're using that platform to call for change, positive social change in a variety of areas. And we think this is where that intersection occurs. Our programs are represented here, and they reflect a lot of the same initiatives and goals of many of the sport organizations in our world. We also offer some courses in sport that relate to sport leadership, governance, society. We partner with organizations like the CFL Players Association to offer them some leadership and culture and communication training. I love that course. It's so fun. I'm stared at by, 20 giant football players, and it's just great work. It really gives you an insight into what leaders these athletes really are. And so here we are in this webinar series, Sport, Leadership, and Social Change, and how those intersect through sport and in sport. We're calling for today, in particular, change in terms of leadership within sport, but looking to sport to foster that kind of leadership. We've got some Olympians here online that can speak to that, the kind of education you gain. Please pose your questions in the chat. We'll be monitoring that, and we'll invite you in. We'll invite the questions in. We'll try to address them, weave them into the conversation. You may feel like, oh, she's not talking about my question, but it's probably because it's in the lineup of topics we have arranged already. So we'll get to it. And sometimes I will invite you to even turn your mic on and have a go at participating. Now, my great panel here today, we have these four fabulous individuals. Andrea Proske, who's an Olympic rower, and I've watched her career with such delight as she went on to win one of the most exciting races I've ever seen at the Olympics in rowing in Tokyo. We've got Andrea Neil, soccer player, coach. She's participated in UBC, Whitecaps, Soccer Canada, and a huge safeguarding advocate, but also an advocate for equity in sport and beyond. Many of you will know Jen Fraser, who's been speaking widely about the book that she's written about the bullied brain. She's done a lot of research into the impact that bullying actually has on our physiology, our neurology, and has lots to share around that. And this is something we don't talk about enough, I think, of the costs of people who've been abused, but also then are trying to seek justice. Man, the costs are huge. People don't do it lightly. And Wendy MacGregor, who is a new and dear friend of mine, responsible for developing something called the Athlete Zone, which is a not-for-profit organization that will help athletes navigate the sport integrity process. So it's challenging and it's new, and we're all learning together. And so to have an advocate supporter like Wendy and her colleagues, we're very fortunate. And it's great to see us learn with such speed. Some contact information, and also next up we've got part 5 and the last part in this suite of episodes on building cultural integrity, where I'll invite some advocates and activists, April 4th, and we hope to see you then. You'll hear more from us on that shortly. Thank you. And let's get to it. I always start by asking our panelists, and I'll start with Wendy, please, and move around the circle to tell us a little bit about your path into sport and what is making you devote so much of your time, your energy, your work to sports still. Because, many of us have spent years and years in sport for whatever reason, as a parent, a participant. And at some point, you kind of retire from that. But it seems like all of you are still very committed and devoted. Can you tell us more about that? Let's start with Wendy, please.
Okay. Well, I spent my youth from a very young age ski racing. Went to 2 Canada Games, competed for my university in Can-Ams, and also played varsity university soccer. And this is something Jen and I were talking the other day about, how this development as a youth contributed to me having a personal identity as an athlete. And so then, my athletics didn't stop when I left university. Sports are part of every day of my life. I became a marathon runner and a triathlete and played pickup hockey, and because I have the confidence to go into a weight room with a bunch of men, because I have the confidence that came from being an athlete my whole life. And so I think that's a really enormous gift. And so that's part of my commitment to this, is just wanting to loving sport. My best friends come from sport. My husband and I met through sport. It's such a significant part of my life that I want to continue to promote and share the positives, the benefits of sport. But I'm also extremely aware of the harms. I, for sure, myself had really difficult coaches who were crossing the line, who were breaking many rules, who probably wouldn't survive in today's environment. One of those coaches I actually lodged a formal complaint against, and it ended up harming my career, not his. So I had that experience to draw upon. And then what happened later was that I became connected with the women ski racers who brought their coach Bertrand Charret to a criminal trial in Montreal. And I was very involved in that trial, flying back and forth to be a support person to those athletes, and watching that take place and seeing the impact on them, the years that it took, the emotional burden. That was when I decided. I was already a lawyer. I had been working on lots of issues that were related to abuse and maltreatment in sport, like bullying, sexual violence. But this is the moment 10 or more years ago when I turned around and said, I'm going back to law school. I'm doing a master's in law specifically on abuse of athletes. And so since then, I've been totally focused on this field.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And great overview, and capturing a lot of what I think many of us resonate with. Andrea Proske, would you mind going next? Just as I said that, you had a cough.
Absolutely. Yes, so another rower on the call here. I spent a decade in rowing, beginning quite late. I started my sporting journey at the age of 27. During that time, I did train under an abusive coach at a national level. When that coach was let go, in part due to his maltreatment, abuse, bullying, sexual harassment, I did get a fairy tale ending. I won Olympic gold in Tokyo 2020 with a uniquely female coached crew. And during my time on the team, I was also the athlete rep. That period really switched my view from athletes as products to key stakeholders. And so naturally, once I hung up the oars, I decided to continue on with AthletesCAN. I am the vice president of AthletesCAN, which is an independent nonprofit that we're also the voice of 6,000 current and retired Canadian athletes. That includes para and able-bodied. And in my free time, when I'm not also working my 9 to 5, I'm also an international sports commentator for rowing, canoe, and kayak.
Thank you. And Jen Fraser.
Well, I'm kind of ashamed to present myself in this very talented group of athletes because I am not a great athlete. I love fitness, and I love to run, and I love to hike and be in nature, and I did a little bit of baseball and soccer as a kid, but I am not an illustrious athlete like yourselves. However, I do join your passion and commitment to seeing change in athletics. And for me, my work goes beyond. What I really study is abuse. And it's really interesting to me that we sometimes think that the abuses that are occurring in sport are different from other areas. And really, their similarities are stronger. Of course, there's differences, but there's really strong similarities. So I ended up entering in about a little over 10 years into this area of focus for my research and my writing and advocacy, because I was witnessing a sporting abuse situation. And what really fascinated me about it was how we didn't have the capacity or the knowledge to address it properly. And I'm very hopeful. I feel like there's a real tipping point happening, and that we're moving in a direction where there's a great body of people on all parts of the spectrum, people who've been wired to believe that abuse is a necessary evil, people who are trying to cover up that they actually have a mental illness that compulsively makes them do harm, people that are trying to stop it from happening, victims, leaders. We have this huge range from institutional complicity all the way to, the whistleblower. It's a really fascinating time, and I feel like change is near, and I'm excited to be a part of that movement and working with all the different stakeholders, especially the athletes in sport, to see change. So yeah, I think the brain science personally, and I can talk more about that as the call goes on, I believe it's the neuroscience that's going to help us change the vocabulary, change the way we look at things, and therefore move forward in a healthier, much healthier way.
We're really seeing that with a greater understanding of trauma too, the actual impact trauma has on people. And how we respond in a traumatized state, right? That's so great to just watch all the education coming out of this, at least, and the language. I really want to make sure we come back to whistleblowing too, because I didn't have that in my list of questions, but I think there's a lovely thread here between all of us in terms of that too. And as Wendy kicked off, you know, the backlash you can experience where you're demonized for calling out what's perhaps needs to be fixed is quite a fascinating little phenomenon when we set our rage aside. All right. And Andrea Neil, so great to see you. Welcome.
Well, thank you for having me. What a great panel, and I'm looking forward to hopefully contributing today. So my story about sport started in my mother's womb, and I was born with a dislocated hip that remained undiagnosed until I was 6 months old. After surgery and time in a partial body cast, the doctors told my parents I wouldn't run well at all. And where I wanted to start with this is, you know, my parents had a choice of what kind of culture they were going to create for my upbringing, and they let me play. And sport became a big part of that eventually, of my healing in certain ways, and to eventually be able to run fairly well. And very much the coaches I had when I grew up were very heart-centered in their nature, whether or not they realized it or not. They were creating a climate which was growth-oriented, where we could learn. I never intended to be a soccer player. In fact, the main sport that I played as a youngster was badminton. And I actually got a hold of a soccer environment where I played with younger players for a certain period of time. And they were dynamos. And that's where I really improved, was that the culture that the coaches and the managers created, plus the players themselves wanting to grow. And then my growth as a soccer player catapulted from there. And I had an opportunity to get a trial with a provincial team, then the national team that very same summer. And I couldn't choose soccer because badminton was my first sport love. So I actually quit both, at least put them on pause for a year, and traveled on a tall ship, because I had this mini midlife crisis. I couldn't choose where I wanted to go. Long story short, I was in a motorcycle accident in the Dominican Republic and split my knee open from side to side. And it's sometimes in the moments where the situation seems really, really negative that we can become really clear with where we want to go. And I think this is a larger theme probably for today. For me, I realized that there are certain things I needed to move away from. And one of the things that I needed to move towards was soccer. I loved the sense of community. I love the sense of doing something bigger and beyond just myself. And I love to learn, really. I was growing and learning how to kick a ball. And I was very fortunate that the sports that I played transferred over really well, and the history I had into this game, and spent 18 years with the women's national team, and really caught the wave of women's sporting growth, but specifically in soccer, of the participation numbers and viewership numbers and where the game was going in the world. So I was very fortunate to ride that wave. And then I felt after 18 years that was it. I spent a year reflecting on what that really means, my sporting experience, especially as a female athlete, really philosophizing about it. And then had an opportunity to coach within the women's national team as an assistant coach. And that's where the viewfinder as an athlete is there. You're focused, you know what you need to do. When you start to cross over onto the other side of the sideline, your viewpoint gets wider. And I too was an athlete rep and a former captain. And now I got to see behind the curtain, per se, with a lot of the elements that were going on behind closed doors. because I was just closer to it, and spent 2.5 years there, coaching within the women's national team program, but also having my eyes wide open to some of the harms, a lot of the harms that were happening. So after that experience, I thought, I'm done. I'm out of sports, and spent a little bit more time again reflecting on and healing on how I need to look at sport and redefine what it is. I think within my life, sport in its essence for me is neither good nor bad. It's how we utilize sport within our life and why. So I got into coaching more, more community, got pregnant, ended up having a young son. And that also shifts things, because now I start to watch the grassroots. It's not just a national team thing. And what are the communities and the environments that our young ones are growing up in? And I began to work not just with athletes, but coaches one-on-one, because for me to work with the athletes, it was not enough to shift them. If you work with one coach, you you help to shift an entire team. And so I went about embarking on creating a methodology for helping to teach coaches from a technical standpoint, and realizing that's not enough, that we needed to broaden the lens and really talk about what it is to lead, and what are the attributes that we need to develop within ourselves, to create that environment where we can enable people to flourish more and grow and understand the power of sport within our lives in a positive way. I've now since taken that methodology and transferred it over into educational institutions and corporate world, because I now understand really what I'm talking about is the process of how we go about making our decisions, why we do how we go about communicating, and why, how we go about our leading. And there isn't a lot of education, I think, out there that's really talking about the inner states that we need to develop and cultivate within ourselves, so we can create safe and thriving environments. So that's where I've landed. I love sport. I think it's great medicine, but it is something that we genuinely have to, I think, shift the meaning about what it is, and who we need to become in order to lead it in the best way possible.
Perfect segue, because that's the next thing we were going to dive into, is redefining, or what is it to us? What is sport for? What's its purpose? Why do we even do it? Why should we do it? Just trying to get back to the roots of sport and its true meaning. Anybody want to jump in on that? Yeah, go ahead, Wendy. Well, we just need you.
There we go. It would depend on who you ask. So the vision of sport, you know, for some people, it's about nationalism and it's about Canada winning. And it may also be about, it may also be about the community and the connection. Originally, sport was just for men and for privileged men, and it was about proving their manlyhood and about sort of a militaristic kind of masculine bonding. We've mostly, but not entirely, moved away from that. There are still holdovers of that. I don't think that's where we should be continuing with sport, but I think that the direction we should be trying to take sport is looking at what sport can do for communities and for health and wellness, mental wellness, physical wellness, and addressing a lot of the root issues that we're suffering from across the country, whether it's, you know, drug addiction or keeping kids in school, or name an issue, and there's probably a sport fix. And so I think that that could be the purpose of sport, but there's also just the fun and the joy of it too. So.
The reason Andrea Neil got back in, right? Because of the community and the fun and the learning. Jen Fraser, go ahead.
I just wanted to add on to that all of us have the understanding and sense that sport is incredibly good for our physical fitness. What a lot of people don't know is that sport is one of the best things for your mental fitness and your brain fitness. It literally changes the brain in incredibly positive ways. So with our young people who are struggling so much right now, the most important thing is to keep them in sport because it has the combination of the physical movement, which pumps oxygenated blood up into the brain. It generates BDNF, which is it stands for brain-derived neurotrophic factor, but that's like fertilizer for the brain. You need it for neurogenesis, the birth of new brain cells. You need it for neuroplasticity, the ability of your brain to change and adapt. It's the healthiest thing for the brain. And the other thing that sport does is that it provides a sense of belonging, which is critical. Like that's a lifeline to the brain. And it also lowers cortisol. And cortisol is a stress hormone, super healthy, but it shouldn't be in the brain and body all the time. And in the 21st century, it's way too often in the brain and body. And it does really serious harm to brain health and to body health. And so another answer to sport, if I just can build on what, Wendy already said it, I just wanted to turn what she said about health and well-being into just a little bit more of the neuroscience terms.
Thank you. Yeah, it's good for us. Brings us joy, surrounds us with community. We talked about Carolyn Frono will be on my next one, and she's doing a lot of work in the role sport can play in welcoming newcomers to Canada and building those community connections. Hey, love it. Andrea, go ahead. Neil, and then Proske.
Well, thank you. This really is the start point when I go and talk to different coaches or leaders in organizations is understanding what meaning is, making sense of the world around us, and then really what the purpose is and how to create greater meaning and sense of aim and reason behind what we're doing. And for me, that makes sense. It makes it more coherent. And if we understand that if the greater meaning and purpose of sport is to contribute to health and well-being for our own development as a human being, and we understand what allows us to thrive as a human being from a basic needs perspective, a la connection or freedom, or contribution, then we can actually broaden what the meaning of sport is within our lives. And I think this is where we get lost, is if we pursue sport as an end in itself, we're going to pursue things like winning as the end result of what we're trying to aim at. And I'm not saying, of course, we go for the win in sport or we try to win the race, whatever that is. But if there is a greater meaning and purpose attached to it, then it allows us to learn through the ups and downs that are naturally inherent through the sport experience. And I think where we get lost as leaders or as athletes is when you pursue the gold medal as, well, then I've finally arrived as a human being. Because it's well understood that many people will have bouts of depression at that point because you realize, well, no, that's not it. And I can't climb any higher than the pinnacle podium that I just did. So I think for us to go back to the inherent, what is the purpose of it within our lives, that greater meaning, because it starts to put all the other objectives into their proper place. Then we're not going to try and pursue the winning as form of status or money, etc. And we're going to ride different waves, but it naturally, inherently will help to build us up as human beings. And I think that's where we really need to lead through sport, is to get back on track and to echo many of the other panelists. Thank
Beautiful. You. And Andrea Proske.
Yeah, I don't know what I can add that hasn't already been said, but so much of what Andrea and Jen say are really speaking to my soul right now. I think from an athlete perspective, why has kind of had about 3 chapters in my life, you know, elevating self, inspiring the game, and then playing it forward. So when I first started, I used to say my favorite thing about rowing had nothing to do with the sport itself. It was the people I surrounded myself with. It was learning how to fail forwards. It was breaking down barriers and figuring out what I was capable of. You know, in terms of inspiration, once I got onto Team Canada, you know, I had someone once tell me that, you know, people who wear the leaf protect or inspire. And in rowing, we have this really powerful moment before you go to a World Championships or an Olympics where you get this little 5-cent vinyl decal of maple leaf and you put it on your oar and you race and you feel like $1,000,000. And when racing is over, it's taken off and it's a reminder of hard work to earn the leaf again. And then once I hung up the oars, talking about playing it forward, I went down to Team Bahamas and I was a head coach there. And here I was in this primarily Black and female environment, seeing sport through a whole other lens than, you know, white privileged self. That this was a ticket to a way forward. This was something really meaningful and tangible. And Jen, what you're saying about how important sport is for the future, EY Global did this really interesting study where 95% of female CEOs, which is a very small percentage, but 95% of them have a background in sport. So when we're reinvesting in the community and we're teaching, especially women, how to be good athletes, we're not just teaching them how to go in a straight line backwards for 2 kilometers like myself, we're teaching them so much more.
Great.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just getting that link so people can have it. But yeah, Ernst & Young, and it's a well-referenced study, but such a good, important study that shows that most women in those leadership roles have some kind of, and I would say all leaders have a sport background or some connection to it. You know, doesn't mean you have to have been a big time athlete. To Jen's point, you know, it's the participating in the community, I think, that has so much power, that because all the learning that happens. Outstanding. Okay, and so now here we are, and we're kind of gradually pointing to, but right now we're in trouble. And like Andrea was pointing out, you know, never waste a good crisis, because crisis does put us under pressure and forces us, you know, imagine your house is burning. What are you going to grab? What's most important to you? And it's the same with any kind of, so here we are in crisis in sport in Canada, I would say, with the number of issues emerging, scandals, claims, horrible. And we're actually gaining quite a negative reputation as a sporting nation because of this. And so what are we learning, and what's it pointing us to and reminding us? So it is a beautiful tipping point. All right. So Andrea Neil was talking a bit about medals and how that can start to hijack our vision of sport and with its meaning. Or masculinity is another one Wendy MacGregor was bringing up, that it's all about manhood and proving how tough you are, which can really get us into trouble when we push through things. So tell us more. Let's talk a little more about what are the power dynamics you're seeing in sport right now? What are the representations of power? Can you give us maybe some examples and experiences that people, I'm sure, will then relate to? Anybody like to start with that? Like whistleblowing. I'm going back to Wendy's sharing how getting involved, making a formal complaint, and then it impacts your career actually more than the person that you're concerned about. So what are the power dynamics you're seeing in sport? Where does power exist? How is it being abused or misused? What kind of problems are we seeing with different things that kind of, like the medal, it holds a lot of power because of status and, oh, I've arrived and somehow I mean more, which we all know is not necessarily true. How about Wendy and then Andrea?
Well, I guess the thing is that the power dynamics are everywhere in sport. They're between junior and senior athletes. They're between male and female athletes, or male coaches and female athletes. There are racial dynamics that come into play. There are administrators and board members and sponsors. And so that it's a tough question to answer, because sport is just rife with power dynamics, and there's always someone who has power over someone else, and the athlete is usually the person with the least amount of power. That's how I would sum it up.
Yeah, it's everywhere. Power is everywhere. I love Brene Brown says power, and I think she coined it, but who knows where she got it from. But this idea there's power over, Wendy's referencing, and then, but there's power too. We all have a lot of power too, and within and with. Hey, love that. Love that description of it. But power everywhere in sport, and there can be these imbalances immediately. Okay, Andrea Proske, what were you going to share?
Yeah, just sharing a little bit of a personal side of this, coming to sports so late. I had worked a proper 9-to-5 job. I was a manager. I understood what a professional environment looked like. I perhaps was impressionable, but certainly not young. And so when we think about, power imbalances, quite often the first thing that springs to mind is this big age gap. So surprising to me that I was aware as an adult that how I was being spoken to, the ultimatums I was receiving, the exercises punishment that I was getting was not normal, that this was not something that any HR would ever stand for in the working world. And yet time and again, I had to decide between my moral compass and my Olympic dreams, understanding that getting to the finish line of Tokyo happened by kind of standing on the shoulders of some of the women who did stand up and say, this isn't right, this shouldn't happen, and had their Olympic dreams dashed. So I think when we're talking about power imbalances, I'm just going to challenge us all to redefine what those can look like, because they're not just young, impressionable women, right? Like this happens regardless of ability, gender, or age.
Yeah, I would love to add on to that. I think when we talk about power imbalance, just building on both of those really important comments, age is really the greatest power imbalance. And this might have been, as Andrea is saying, this might have been what saved her, in the sense that she had enough years on the planet to identify what is wrong, and not naturally, like a child or a youth or even a young adult does, normalize whatever the authoritarian adult is telling them is normal. And just another brain aspect to this that many don't know, that's really an important factor, is from the age of 13 to 24, 25, the brain is undergoing incredibly intense change. And it makes young people, the developing brain of adolescents and 20-somethings, extremely vulnerable, and especially vulnerable to threats to their status and their belonging to the group. So one of the most powerful weapons for the abusive individual is humiliation, shaming and humiliation that drives you out of the group. And this brings us full circle to Jen's focus on whistleblowing. Whistleblowing can be used in the adult world even. The threat of being driven out from the group is so painful. 90% or more will never whistleblow. They have good moral compasses, but they cannot bear the thought of losing the community. It's too threatening to the brain. It threatens your livelihood, obviously, but it also threatens your brain. So I just think there's lots of ways to it personally for me to address the power imbalance. I think we need to empower. We need to empower with knowledge, education, and then, of course, great laws, legislation, the kind of work that Wendy does. We need all of these things to change, and that's when we're going to start to see a much healthier sporting world and a healthier world in general.
And thanks to all of you, because I feel like you're all educators in this realm. You're all helping people understand, navigate the different aspects, give the language. You're all really advocating for that kind of learning within the space. It's fabulous to see. And the reference, I had a young coach say to me once, because, it's an infuriating comment for me, the gray zone of coaching. I'm like, there's no gray zone. You're either abusing someone or you're not. And he said, yeah, but I could never articulate it. And this young guy said, well, you're either pushing them in or pulling them out. Very easy little line to define. And exercises punishment pushes them out, right? So Andrea Neil, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd love to build with everybody else. I recently did a TED Talk, and I didn't want to do a TED Talk. That takes a lot of work. And part of it was very therapeutic to go and do it, because I had to spend a lot of time trying to articulate things as simply as I could and have an idea worth spreading. But where I landed on this is really to talk about power and that ability to influence another human being or a situation. which is really what we're talking about. And this can be done in a powerful, empowered way, or it could be used in a way to dominate others. And so some of the language that I really wanted to, I don't even think it's introducing, but put out into the sport world through the TED Talk was the difference between domination and transformation. Because many of the behaviors we're talking about is control over another human being for the purposes of feeding something within me, a lack of sense of self-worth, and therefore I'm going to try and push another human being down. And we can all think of these domination type behaviors that we've experienced from grassroots to international play. And that is the core essence of, for me, what sits underneath the abuse. When we've become really disconnected from our heart and where we are as a human being, we're going to attempt to fill up some sort of negative, or fill up with negative behaviors and actions that void within ourselves. So one of the I guess, hallmarks of a domination type model is the hierarchy that is present within sport. And if you get people lodged as gatekeepers throughout this hierarchy that are attempting to dominate others or comply with this type of domination, a lot of harm can be influenced throughout. Versus if you have people within these roles, or when coaches or leaders build that environment about transformation, about positive change, that we're learning through the ups and downs, this is where we have that potential to thrive, and where I think language is really important, because it creates that meaning of what we need to move away from and where we need to move towards.
And this hierarchy, do people have examples of that in gatekeeping? You know, it's tough because you don't want to name names necessarily or draw attention, but perhaps cases that you're witnessing now, and that you can see these things happening in the media. You know, I'm thinking of the bobsled situation where bobsleigh skeleton, the members, a lot of NSO, National Sport Organization members, are then the clubs, and they show up for their annual meeting, and they tried to have this meeting where they wanted to bring up some of their concerns about the leadership, about the hierarchy, the power dynamics. And the chair just shut the meeting down. As she could see where it was going, she just stopped it. And really, like that, but who's going to stop her from stopping it, right? So it was an interesting thing to watch, because even though it's against the rules, it's against the act, she did it, and there was no way to there was no recourse. So what do you do? What are some other things you've experienced or watched or witnessed or noticed in sport that illustrate these power dynamics, power imbalances? What do you think, or experience that you?
I think they're the litmus tests of where truly an organization is when there's an issue, which inherently issues are going to rise up. This is part of leadership, to be able to deal with these situations that arise. But the litmus tests are the point where you're going to see whether or not you're congruent as a leader or an organization at that moment, that what you've said or put up on your website, if those words are now going to be put into action. And so you really see the culture getting played out in those cases. And that's where the hierarchy is. So if something were to genuinely change, it means as an organization or a leadership group, we have to change or act out those scenarios, or you make the whistleblower go away. And that's where you're back into congruence. Everything is okay. And I think this is where this dynamic gets played out, instead of having a revolution within ourselves that we have to change to create a better circumstance for those whom we are serving. It often is easier to make the noise go away.
Absolutely. Wendy.
Yeah, one of the things that I have looked at and written about is that we need to try to get some of our sport leaders to recognize that positive motivation can get better results often than the old school kind of coaching. We still have a lot of the traditional coaches that think they need to help you take it to the next level by being tough, by the tough love principles. And something that I've drawn upon is how we've changed our parenting styles, how parents used to think that children would respond to being spanked, and that was like the way to, or yelling at their kids, and that the dominating model of parenting has really gone out the window. I mean, for most educated people, and the parents in Western society, most parents that I know are trying to engage with positive encouragement, motivation, in empowering kids to be part of decision making, all things we need to be doing in sport. And we can also look to the model of what we've done in schools. And I know schools still have lots of issues, but it's still, there isn't the same kind of, children aren't being beaten in the schoolroom when they don't have their homework done. And so it's almost like sport is the last to get the message. And there are still people in powerful positions who are holding on to these old principles.
So we're seeing hierarchy, a structure, we're seeing practices that, and beliefs, hey, that oh, this is how we get the results, which are kind of Neanderthal and really not as evolved as we would like them to be. What else? Where else do we see that, Jen?
I was just going to add that I love that you use the word beliefs, Jen, because if we look at that from a neuroscience point of view, beliefs in your brain is how your brain is being wired. And as Wendy points out, we've been through a watershed change. And that is that we unwired destructive wiring in our brains as parents. And we said, you know what? There is no research, there's no evidence that says you strike a child and you get results. In actual fact, what the research shows is you hurt their prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that makes good decisions, that looks to the future, that understands consequences, that's rational and reasonable. Well, every single time you strike a child from a position of power when you should be caring and nurturing, and so you're just scrambling their brain, you're specifically hurting the part of the brain that will help them have good conduct in the future. So it's a non-productive act. Same thing for yelling. Most people have no idea that yelling actually does physical damage to the brain. It can be seen on brain scans. And this is the next level of change that we have to make. And I write about these subjects all the time on Psychology Today. And what fascinates me is they write me back and say, we've put this into a different category. We put it into essential. We put it onto our Google algorithm and we're going to promote it. Because even Psychology Today knows that most of us don't know this, and coaches certainly don't know this. But if we told them, you know, going back to what Andrea is saying, we can help them change the wiring of their brains so that they lay down new neural networks, namely new beliefs. And they fire up these new beliefs like hitting is not going to get results. Yelling is not going to get results. I want to own the podium. Maybe I should follow the research and not the behaviors that have zero research to back them up. None.
Andrea, go.
I love everything about this conversation because I think that archetype of the old school coach, as Wendy so rightly said, you know, it leads the person who leads by fear in this like misguided attempt to create like the bulletproof athlete who follows the rules, that can unfortunately create results, but not longevity. And I remember when the coach was let go and another coach came in, one of who, Kara Love, who's on the call right now. I remember them saying earth-shattering things to me like, good job, and I'm proud of you. And this switch to an athlete-centered, safe sport, compliant coaching style, I can't tell you how easy it was for me to push myself to my physical limits every single day because I was standing on solid ground. I was heard, I was part of a team, and we got a gold medal out of it. Because our coaches understood that the medal was the byproduct of the journey. And I think that's something we don't think about. We prioritize these results. And that's why I want more and more stories to come forward of how athlete-centered can also mean standing on the podium.
You know, and Andrea's experience, it was interesting, you know, all the women involved in surrounding that group of women were people from my era, where we also experienced something very similar. But how did it get dropped? And then how has it been dropped? It's been dropped again, I would say. And so why can't we sustain once we do get it, because they got it, what's going on that makes us kind of lose that again? Like, what is the power dynamic? What shifts? What comes back into play? What scares people about a wonderful partnership between coach and athlete, you know, where there's no hierarchy? What are we afraid of? Why does it disappear? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I know when I finished, I really, really had this strong sense that I didn't want us to be a lightning in a bottle team. We weren't, right? There was a formula to what we did, and it was something that could be repeatable by other groups. And yeah, I know. Yeah, but I see Wendy unmuting. Maybe she has the answer for us.
Go for it.
I was just thinking that maybe people holding onto power and this hierarchy are doing so out of fear, that they are trying to preserve their own positions. And it's also what they've known and what they've witnessed and what they have participated in. So it's what they're familiar with. And then the new it creates fear. And if they give up some power, what are they losing? So it's getting people to have a different understanding that Jennifer just pointed to, that it doesn't have to be that way. But unless you've experienced it, then often people just don't recognize the truth.
And in a way, maybe they feel like they'll be pushed out, you know, and that. So how do we do this? How do we introduce a new way without canceling out the old school? It's tough because some people, Wendy and I have had this chat where it gets to a point, actually, and Andrea's experienced it, where that coach needed to go, right? They've done some real harm and multiple layers of it. So they do need to be pushed out of sport. But how do we keep them calm, not afraid, help them see that this is good for everyone? What do you think? How do we bring in a power balanced model? Ideas, Andrea? And then Jen?
Well, I think a lot of what happens in sport is mirroring what is in society as well. And there are hierarchies all throughout, where you mentioned, Andrea, about female CEOs, that it's a small percentage. Many have participated in sport, but women are not holding a lot of these leadership positions because, for me, a lot of the inherent qualities are well, it's difficult also to raise a family as a mother in many of these positions, but secondarily, a lot of it is about domination, which is the opposite of partnership societies. So I think it's reflecting like what kind of cultures and societies we have within our country that permits this also to take place inside and outside of sport. The domination is something that sits underneath the abuse and harm, and it is fear-based because it's about creating an identity. If I don't have this role, if I don't have this status, then who am I as a person? And if you're clinging on to that, you're holding on to that, you're not going to want that job. That's where that lack of congruency happens, and you need to make people go away. So are the people that have this level of fear, as we all have fear within us, but when we're in leadership roles, we have influence over many. So I think it needs to be a process of doing a lot of inner work, or get people who are more transformational leaders that can lead that change, that you can still have the hierarchy, but it depends on who is up at the top and how they oversee that environment of just the basic human rights and needs of dignity, freedom, and justice.
And Andrea, Proske has just shared a link that, you know, the number of women CEOs is finally outnumbered than those named John.
Oh boy, we've got a lot.
But also to Andrea Neil's point, you know, this is our society, and it is a very colonial, patriarchal, imperialistic, capitalistic society, and these are fundamental beliefs. So we're kind of used to these hierarchies, but do we, you know, women are discovering too that, do I even want that CEO role? It gets kind of ugly, and I would rather operate as a team or whatever. Or
Well, and another hallmark of those domination type cultures is a lack of empathy. And, you know, we're not going to flourish as human beings if we don't have more heart-centered. I'm talking about the heart-centered empathy here and compassion. So do you want, as a leader, to even go into these environments and attempt to duke it out within it when it really stifles these qualities within us?
exactly. And Jen Fraser, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that it's quite interesting that one of the distinctions between the male brain and the female brain, and it's always on a spectrum. So it doesn't mean that men are exactly this way and women are exactly this way. But one of the key distinctions between the female and male brain is that the female brain is wired for empathy, which makes a lot of sense from an evolutionary point of view. You know, as Andrea was saying, as mothers, you know, we were in the role almost always of raising the children. So empathy was key to how we operated in the world. The male brain is more focused on systems development. More interesting, I think, in terms of Jen Walinga's question around, you know, power dynamics and hierarchies, what the research shows is that the more power you have, the less empathy. There's an inverse relationship between the two, which is very dangerous, as we're seeing in international politics right now. What we need to do is have leaders, anyone who has any real power has to be constantly wired in with the empathy. They need to be listening to children's voices. They need to listen to, you know, watch kids, be involved with people in need, people with disability, whatever it is. They need a daily firing up of that neural network, because the more power they get, the more it gets eroded. The brain has limited resources. And so if we funnel it all into power, empathy goes out the window. And that's, as we can see, what's unfolding. It's not safe for any of us.
Well, and just to add to that, I think it's more of that invitation for us to return to the heart, because it's not just in the brain, but these qualities within us that are more heart-centered, that allow us to have the wisdom also of doing the right thing at the right moment for the correct person. That for me is a heart-centered quality. And if we're just always up here, we could be living in fear as opposed to empathy, what is needed and required.
And the science would say to that, oh, that Jennifer Fraser wasn't giving you the full picture, because the full picture is the nervous system. The nervous system is how the gut and the heart and the brain talk to each other. And so really, when I'm saying brain, I'm just using it as shorthand, because you're absolutely right, Andrea. Of course, it's how the heart and the brain and the gut all connect.
Awesome.
We're physiological beings, hey? Now we've got some cool concepts to be thinking about, like systems brains and empathy brains. And so those, of course, could work together, couldn't they? Couldn't we have wonderfully heart-centered systems? And so maybe that's a way to invite hierarchical minds, power over minds, dominant minds into the conversation. And I do find that, like when we talk cultural systems, that there are these powerful leaders that are pretty intrigued by it. And I think because they see levers, probably for power, but we can build systems that could be more kind. I've got questions about, you know, education, and Peter Baxter, always a lovely attendee here, has such a long history in sport leadership, and asking about, you know, educating the parents as such important stakeholders and also contributors to this mindset of dominate, beat them, get on the Olympic team right now. And so Terry Clark's asking about examples, and thanks, Jen, and others who want to share some parent organizations. I feel like Respect Group does some work, and also What Not to Yell is an organization out there that's directed at parents. But True Sport too, of course, has lots of materials and would welcome your invitation to come in and speak to organizations. Absolutely. The power. And so, you know, a Lord Acton's quote, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And Jen's supporting that too. And we've seen it. As soon as you're there, this is what happens. What do we do about it? Wendy, more stories or solutions?
Yeah, I'm thinking more strategic solutions. So education. We need to broadly educate the sport communities, all the stakeholders, about what maltreatment looks like, the full range. We can't be focused on sexual abuse or something that's criminal abuse. We need to understand all the forms of maltreatment so that not so that we can be constantly litigating and having disruption in our sport worlds, but so we can have conversations, so we can actually address issues at early stages before they fester and become something larger. So then in order to do that, we also have to create less hierarchy and safe spaces where people feel comfortable having conversations. And we need to give athletes leadership positions so that there is an athlete that can represent the other athletes, whether it's on a board or even just to go to the coach to represent the team, to say we're feeling this and know that you're going to be heard. So we need to break down that hierarchy a bit, create the safe space for the conversation, empower the athletes to give them a voice. And then we also need to do things like, on the boards and with coaching, have more diversity, have more women involved, have lots of turnover, not in the coaching, but like at the board level. Don't let one group of people dominate the sport, dominate the leadership. I think we need to have regular turnover and make sure that we're getting new ideas all the time.
Brilliant. And those things are cool nowadays, right? Diversity is cool. And so it is kind of happening, and it's kind of hopeful that we know some of these things are changing across sport, and therefore indirectly they are going to have a powerful impact on kind of balancing the power more. Yeah, I wrote something. Oh, go ahead. You talk.
There's one more thing I meant to say, which was we need to also intentionally hire and promote people that are embodying these goals. So as opposed to promoting the coach that wins, we need to promote the coaches that are actually making space for the conversations and empowering the athletes and having a healthy team that's focused on wellness and athlete well-being.
Because you think of these people coming through the door, the narcissists who are going to inflict harm and have strategies to do so in a whole toolbox at their disposal. They're walking in a door that's wide open to them, right? Many times. So there's not enough policy, not enough checks and balances to ensure that this person is going to be aligned with the values of sport. But then there's also that there's a real tendency to just overlook a lot of things and just look at the medals and hire people because they've been successful. Good. So both angles, and developing leaders, right, who see this stuff and understand that beautiful list that Wendy just gave us. What else? What else can we do? Go ahead, Andrea. Proske.
I think shifting when we're defining power imbalance, shifting that not just from the people, the coaching, the people in charge, but also to equity amongst athletes as well. So one of the things I'm really passionate about, not just because I'm expecting my first child, but I have the privilege of chairing a pregnancy and parental rights group alongside the COC Athlete Council. And we're doing some great work with the University of Alberta. For those on the call who don't know, although I see a lot of sports related people in the chat, in order to get your funding, and we call that carding every month, you have to hit certain standards. There is a card that you can get called an injury card if you're injured for a longer period of time that allows you to have income for a whole year so that you can recover and then come back to sport. Pregnancy at a national level is considered an injury card, which means that once you have one child and you come back and your body is different, or you decide you want to have a second one, that you have no funding available to you. So we are precluding 50%. With Paris coming up, being the first gender equal sport, we're precluding 50% of our athletes from continuing on in sport. So that's something where we have a University of Alberta put forward a white paper to Sport Canada, where they are talking about really meaningful nitty-gritty changes, sporting policy changes on a national level, because right now what's happening is we are relying on the national sporting organizations to make those changes themselves within them. And unfortunately, I think this is something that has to come top down.
I think that says a lot about our culture and the way in which we use language, that you would consider pregnancy an injury. That says a lot. And that, I spent a lot of time on a physiotherapist table when I was an athlete, and there was this phrase up on the wall, and it said, perspective is a state of mind. And that's like one of the biggest issues that we're talking about here is if you see it this way, all of the policy, all of the decision, the way that you communicate your communications, the way that you enforce boundaries or don't have boundaries, is everything's going to go in that way. Versus if you have a heart-centered perspective, then it's going to look completely different. And the way in which you lead is going to be completely different. But I find that very intriguing. And I think it says a lot.
And it's funny because sport is heart-centered. We're in love with it. So much passion, right, is at the base of it. And collaboration is central to sport. Like it's inherent in the actual activity. You have to rely on your opponent, your teammates, your, people supporting you if you're an individual sport. It's so weird that we can't seem to translate it into our other reality.
In the leadership, one of the things that you're going to need to have to lead in a heart-centered way is courage. Because we're talking about setting boundaries when people don't understand what is the environment we need to cultivate, how do we protect it? And if we have a perspective that's based off of status or that power that you're talking about, when something goes wrong, you're not going to see a boundary you're going to enforce. That takes courage, because inevitably people are not going to fancy being told they need a timeout or time away or you're done. So courage, I think, is the gateway to all of these other virtues. These are states of being that we need to live, not just doing skills. What is it that we need to do work on ourselves that is getting in the way of us showing up in this way? And what do we need to move towards? What do we need to cultivate? Courage for me is the gateway, because we're going to have hard inner looking. And then to exude dignity and love and care and sometimes strength with boundaries.
I'm seeing a lot of very courageous people on the line today, along with our attendees, but also noticing a lot of the courageous individuals working in this realm, linking up and connecting and building a bit of I don't like to use army because it's so militaristic, but it is this group that is very powerful, a community that are working, I don't like to say fighting, working toward positive change. If we look at our Canadian sports system, where are we seeing the things that we could tweak, policy in terms of diversity, in terms of decision-making, hierarchies, structures, practices, beliefs, underlying assumptions, what Andrea Neil is talking about, governing us, which then sort of shows up in all the artifacts that we create. That are very patriarchal, very colonial, and we can tweak all of those things. Where are we seeing a need to shift and reshape or reframe how we do things in Canada that might help?
I always am surprised, because I look at abuse in all kinds of different contexts, not just sport. I'm always surprised that sport doesn't lead the way, and I think that this is something sport can do. Because sport understands better than all other, except for maybe the arts, it understands better than all other sort of walks of life that repetition at timed intervals is how learning happens. So we practice. Repetition at timed intervals is how the brain learns, and the brain learns by making mistakes. So if you're in a culture like what rower Andrea has described, that is incredibly caring and supportive and is full of positives and just this sort of Andrea Neil love all over the place, you rise up. You really rise up, because your practice has the meaning that Andrea Rower was describing. The idea that, you're winning that medal for your coach, you're winning it for your country, you're winning it for your team, and yourself. Like, it doesn't have that status attachment anymore. And so what we need to learn is to practice daily. We're not going to learn courage. So we've talked a lot about how fear drives very destructive behaviors, and we're all aware of that, but we don't have our athletes and our coaches daily practicing courage so that they can become heart-centered and not so full of fear. So when we talk about safe sport, I mean, for me, of course, I hear safe sport, people talk about psychological safety in the workplace. It's not. It's neurological safety. It's physiological safety. If you want a healthy heart, a healthy gut, and a healthy brain and body, you have to have safety as the absolute baseline. Then you can do all the miraculous things that brains and bodies can do, as we all watch sport for, in awe of what happens.
Love it. Practice. Wendy, you've talked about safe spaces, creating those, and you're trying to do that with your athlete zone, because then we can challenge, right? If we feel safe and like we belong and people are accepting us and we can contribute, then we can actually question how things are being done as well without fear of retribution. Yeah. And then we'll learn all together. Imagine. Wendy.
Yeah, I don't think I have a lot to add. I really agree with what Jennifer just said, that we need to create the safe space. And because we need to be able to have the conversations. And I believe we need to have the conversations early and continually, so that it isn't that something has been allowed to flare up to the point that it's a crisis, because that's when we normally deal with it. Now we're very reactive, and I think we should be proactive, and we should be avoiding those flare-ups, because we've been having conversations all the way along that when somebody feels unhappy or harmed or what, even if it's something minor, they should be able to express it. And if we went back to parenting, the perfect parent would really be so happy if their child was being emotive and saying, I'm feeling this, I'm feeling that, because now you know how to parent them better. Now you know not to force them to eat their vegetables because they're feeling sick. So you have to, so a coach could similarly benefit from knowing how the athletes are feeling. And so if we can get coaches and our sporting worlds to embrace these principles and to recognize that the conversations are going to contribute to building better, happier, safer sport.
Yeah, it'll be good for us, instead of being afraid that if people speak out, it means you're canceled and you're, it's interesting when I write about this, or I have a blog recently that's gone through quite a few edits, because you can tell there's a fear with what I'm calling out. I'm calling out a lack of independence in the way that we structure some of our major multi-sport organizations. And if we just fix the independence, we'd actually bring so much more safety and opportunity for learning. Wendy, you talk in your writing about disruptive innovation, and I wanted to highlight that a little bit. So what does that means? It sounds like such a lovely combination of positive and challenge.
Buzzwords. Yeah, I talk about that because I was really taken with the idea that in technology, there were all these companies like Xerox and Kodak and even BlackBerry, where they were world leaders. They were ahead of everyone else. They dominated, and then they got decimated. And the reason they got decimated was because they dug in, they doubled down on what they'd always done. They weren't prepared to embrace the future, to see the writing on the wall. And I think we are in a similar kind of situation where sport is changing, where there's this groundswell, where people don't want the win at all costs, where we're identifying the harms that has been causing. And I think that the sport leadership needs to recognize that they don't want to be the Xerox and the Kodak, that that people can engage with these new principles that focus on athlete-centered sport and wellness in sport. And we can still have successful teams. In fact, we may have more successful teams. We may have more retention in sport, and we may have athletes that move forward in their lives having more positive feelings about their sport experiences because they didn't have the wins in spite of the harms.
Absolutely. And we've experienced it. And there are so many stories, which we will capture in our little project there, Wendy, of when it does work and lead to greater and more sustainable outcomes, right? Athletes who will be retained or will stay in and contribute in the ways that all of you beautiful people have done. I want to touch a bit on the calls to action, then I'm going to circle back to this idea of the harms that people are actually experiencing right now and what we could put in place. But let's talk a little bit too about, both Andreas have spoken, provided testimony in the committee hearings around the sport crisis and had calls to action recommendations. Can I ask each of you to speak a bit about that? Because you were really coming out of your roles as athletes and had a lot to share, and coaches. Andrea Neil, you want to start?
Oh, all right. Okay, so I got called in to testify in front of the Government of Canada twice last year. The first time in front of the FIWO committee, the Committee of Women, Status of Women, and then the second was the Heritage Committee a few months later. So I gave 3 calls to action. We need a judicial inquiry into the abuse within our national sporting organizations. Of course, we appreciate convening this feedback, but nothing can change until we turn the lights on and reckon with where we are. We cannot change what we cannot see, was my point behind that. Number 2, we need to build our sports organizations with self-scrutiny in mind, clearly establish and communicate the portals for feedback, and commit to looking into what they bring up and taking action, make policies against retaliation for reporting. In a culture so awry, whistleblowers are essential in raising awareness and getting us back on course. The third was commit to a comprehensive forensic audit into Canada Soccer's finances, publicly disclose how funding is being used and why, to ensure the mission of the organization is being carried out ethically and effectively. And I said, and still, until we see things clearly and courageously create a new leadership culture in these organizations, the vulnerable members of our society will continue to be put at risk. And the harm that I have witnessed all too often in my career could happen. We will all fail to flourish, and we need to end it now. So I said, with awareness, effort, and heart-centered compass points, we can.
We can. You know, Nicole and Meredith both have really good questions in the chat right now. I want to draw people's attention to. And so Nicole's building on that. Like, do we need legislative oversight? Do we need government to say, look, we need to really think it through? Now, there's this Future of Sport Commission that's been promised. We haven't heard much about it lately, which is causing a lot of uncertainty and stress for people who are waiting. So that's interesting. And then Meredith, of course, says, yeah, we move way too slowly. And the research has been there for a long time. And we do know mental health is a crisis for kids, and sport can be an answer. Load up the napalm, Meredith recommends. Love that.
I can give you an answer on the legislation. I can give you my view on the legislation.
Yeah.
Legislation can be useful, but more written policies are not helpful if we don't engage with them. And we have lots and lots of policies, and people spend, you know, hours and hours creating documents that no one reads. So an example I have of that is that a policy that we have had in our country for a very long time that a lot of people don't know we have is that we all have a responsibility to report harms to children. We have child protection legislation in every single province in Canada. And when I was doing my research, I was amazed that we were being held up internationally as being a world leader in this because we actually legislated it when other countries like the UK didn't have legislation like this. But that I was reading it going, yeah, but we have it, but we never use it. People don't know that it's there. So we have the documents, but we need to publicize it. We need to punish people when they're not actually doing it. We don't need to constantly create more legislation to legislate things that we already have created those protections. So for me, it's not so much about legislating because, as I said, people don't always know what the legislation is. It's making people engage with the principles. So we have a wonderful universal code of conduct that people put a lot of time into creating for sport. And I think we need to understand that. We need to celebrate that. We need to make sure athletes and coaches and parents know what's in the Universal Code of Conduct and how it empowers them, what rights they're entitled to. And I think that it's more the education about the legislation than creating more.
And there's a great article written in the conversation about how a lot of the problem with governance in sporting, in Canada in particular, I would say, but is this lack of real understanding of their roles and responsibilities of enacting the policies, overseeing, monitoring. And it's this false understanding that we're here to just sort of support the operations and the CEO instead of overseeing it, not in a overlording kind of way, but in a way that's about like a coach, monitoring, educating, evaluating. And then this lack of independence we have across our sports system is problematic as well, because we have conflicts. How do you, like that's being asked for, how do we actually manage these claims with something that is also deciding whether you get money or whatever, it's or whether you get, who gets to educate you or whatever.
The other thing I would say is that the more rules we create, we're creating a sense for people that we're coming to punish you, that it's that it's oppressive, and that that it's creating more division and separation and hierarchy. Whereas I think the vision is that this is good for everyone in sport. This isn't a rule where you're now going to be punished, and so it's creating fear. Someone's coming after me. They're going to try to impose this rule. We should all want these principles and be embracing them because they are better for everyone. So I kind of object to the increasing the policing of sport.
Well, and that's oppression, suppression, division are also hallmarks of that domination culture. And you're right, it erodes wisdom, I think, and you're going to create incentives and punishments if you don't follow this way. Well, it's clear that those incentives and punishments are not working. What we need are wise people that are from wisdom and love that can lead this process. Not more sticks and carrots, because you're going to actually erode qualities like empathy and honesty, because people will try to figure out a way, and it'll be less decision making based off of the context. And when I was listening to you, Wendy, talk, I was also thinking about what does it say culturally that we talked about, where people used to ram people and schools permitted hitting students. What does it also say about us culturally as a society that the people that are overseeing the aquarium are not putting the limits and enforcing the boundaries, like healthy parenting? Children need the healthy boundaries. That's what our job is, not in an oppressive way, but from a place of love, to say, no, you're creating harm, you're hurting the environment, and we need to deal with this to create the aquarium that has more of the system that people can flourish within. And if people who have the oversight above that don't understand, have the incorrect perception of what their role is, then you can't fix it. Or maybe they'll fix it with more policies, in which case you're eroding the very qualities that we need to have within the aquarium.
Thank you. And so we have a lot of the legislation, a lot of the policies, we need to enact them and understand the principles. It's like rule of two, right? People get all bent out of shape about rule of two because it's very difficult to enact. But if you understand the principle of rule of two, which is about power balance, making sure people have representation, it's actually not as hard as people think it can be. I want to get to Andrea Proske. I mentioned the harms. I think we've talked a lot about the ways abuse and power over, many people have talked about it, but Jen's spoken to the impact it's had physiologically, mentally. I'm going to get to Andrea, but before I do, about your testimony and calls to action, because I think it'll be a nice way to finish, but Wendy has more to say. Go for it.
I'll be quick. It's just that when we create more regulation, we also provoke secrecy, and we make people then sneak around, and because they don't want to get caught. So sometimes the too many rules doesn't actually stop the behavior, it just drives it underground.
Polluters, conformers, and the courageous, I'm going to use that C word, but Padilla and Thurgood talk about colluders and conformers. It's how we behave when we feel afraid or we're being oppressed somehow. And it just leads to more of that, right? It's not pleasant. But then there are those who fight and are courageous, but we're also kind of angry and causing problems as well. I've been guilty of that. All right, Andrea, what, harken back to your testimony. How has it evolved? What are some of the things you were calling for?
Yeah, well, back when I had the opportunity to speak with FIWO, I had 3 calls to action. The first was that OSIC services need to be accessible to all levels of sport and adequately funded, with culture tied to NSO funding, not just results. And I think that harkens back to what we were talking earlier about the medals justify the means. We need comprehensive and compulsory education for sports stakeholders on all types of abuse. In short, bystander training. I had support staff who saw what was going on, knew it was wrong, and either didn't have the tools or the safety to report that up. In fact, one of them, is while looking back with the benefit of hindsight of this, this service provider, this who was like, full-grown adult, had a job, could go and get a job anywhere else she wanted, and told me that they stayed because they knew it'd be worse for us if they left, that they were staying to protect us. And lastly, we need a restorative justice approach that does not cause victim re-traumatization. It was tough to go and to share my experience. I know others have. And I know when we started this call, we talked, Jen, you said, it seems like there's more and more stories coming out all the time. And another way to look at that is that, isn't that a great thing that we are creating space to hear those stories, that we are giving weight and value and room to those stories? So it's heartbreaking, but it's also an indication that we are shifting the needle, even microscopically.
Yeah, because we got to heal before we can recover. And we talk about that lots with Truth and Reconciliation, where there's such an energy to let's just move forward and move on, but you can't. You need to actually recover from, and that will allow us to then rebuild, and learn and build that future. And I really appreciate everything that people were sharing, willing to share today and take the time to share. Really prepared. It was wonderful to hear everything that people are working on, and a lot of great language that you were sharing with our attendees and future people who will listen to the recording. And I feel like we're actually encouraging people to move in a direction where, embrace what we have, build on what we have. Let's work on this. It'll be better for everybody if we actually build a system that is healthy and safe and performance based or oriented. And by performance, I often say excellent experiences, because like a little kid on the Timbits field just wants to make a friend and have some fun, right? And that's an excellent experience. That doesn't mean you have to be on a podium. But so moving in the direction, learning, moving in the positive direction of rebuilding. But I heard the biggest message is helping people understand that this change in sport is that disruptive innovation. It's an evolution. It's incredibly powerful. And be part of it, man. Don't be Xerox. It'll be great. We're going to get there. I would sure love to see Canada be a leader like we were around doping, but I don't know. We'll work on it. Thank you all to our attendees for your questions, your comments. It's just such a joy to see such engagement and know that people are out there working on this with us. And please stay in touch. And we'll see you again, I hope, on April 4th for our next webinar. Thank you to everyone. Andrea Neil, Andrea Proske, Wendy MacGregor, and Jen Fraser. Fabulous panel. Great discussion. I have hope.